Good morning, everyone in New Zealand, y muy buenas tardes a todos en Chile. Welcome to the first bilateral seminar brought to you by the Latin America Centre of Asia Pacific Excellence, or LATAM CAPE, here in New Zealand, and the Centre for International Studies of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Our particular greetings to the Ambassador of New Zealand to Chile, Her Excellency Linda Tepuni, the Ambassador of Chile to New Zealand, His Excellency Ignacio Llanos, his predecessor, His Excellency Isaro Torres, other members of government agencies in each country, and colleagues in the Latin American New Zealand Business Council. I'm Dr. Matthew Omar, Director of the Latin America CAPE. Our centre was created 3 years ago to prepare New Zealanders to do business and engage with Latin America. Based at Victoria University of Wellington and backed by a consortium that includes Auckland, Waikato and Otago universities, we deliver programs, resources, events and commission research that encourage businesses and students to include Latin America in their thinking and plans. We have joined our Chilean partners in organising this seminar because we know there are opportunities in the Trans-Pacific trade environment that could be better leveraged by our nation's exporters, including the growing view in Chile that New Zealand can be a development model for that country. Together, we have gathered this morning and this evening just the right people to discuss these themes and introduce them to the over 160 of you who have registered to attend this event. In a minute, we will explain how today's program will run. First, however, I'd like to advise registrants and attendees that we will be recording the session and taking snapshots, screenshots of it, and more particularly, to ask our Chilean co-organisers and co-sponsors of this event to introduce themselves, who they are, and why they have partnered with us to bring this event to you. Maria Paz.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Good morning, everyone in New Zealand, y muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes a todos en Chile. I am María Paz Fernández, Project Manager at the Center for International Studies of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And on behalf of the Center, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today in our seminar. This opportunity is very important to be able to contribute to the dialogue on future bilateral economic relations. Having said that, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. In first place, Dr. Alan Bollard. He is Chair for Pacific Region Business at Victoria University of Wellington and former APEC Executive Director. Rodrigo Yáñez. He is Vice Minister of International Economic Relations of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. Claire Kelly, Assistant Secretary of Trade and Economic at New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Germán González, Macroeconomic Coordinator and part of the Latin American Center for Economic and Social Policies at Catholic University. Thank you very much for being here with us today. So, Jorge.
Thank you, Maria Paz. Good morning in New Zealand. Good afternoon here in Chile. And as Matthew mentioned, since 2018, we have worked with CAPE Latin American Center in strengthening ties between Chile and New Zealand. Both countries share similar characteristics. First, both are small, medium countries with robust institutional and relatively low level of corruption. Second, both are export-based economies. Third, both are open economies, according with the Global Competitiveness Report in 2019. New Zealand is in the 4th place and Chile in the 5th place in their trade policies openness. Both are experiencing the growing role of China as their main trade partner, and both have been active players in the new Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. Finally, New Zealand and Chile is in the most dynamic economic area in the Asia Pacific. In this morning, ProChile, a public agency of the government, presented a report of CSIRO and the Australian government called Global Trade and Investment Megatrends. Among others, the report mentions that digital transformation, the need to invest in supply chain resilience, and the complex geopolitical landscape, along with the less political support for globalization, are key elements to understand the future on the international relations. So this seminar focused on a specific topic on the trade disruptions and how has been the response, or how will be the response for New Zealand and Chile in terms of diversifying the risk and their exports. So I would like to start with Alan Bollard, the former executive director of APEC and also a member of faculty of the Wellington University, to talk about that. Alan, how do you envision the future? What are the tendencies or trends that you have seen and that affects the future of trade?
Gracias, Jorge. And morena to our friends in New Zealand, buenas tardes in Chile to friends and ex-colleagues. It's only a year since the leaders meeting had to be cancelled in Santiago, and what a year we've had. It's been a year of living dangerously for everybody. Like it or not, we've had another year of the US administration with its Make America Great policies. We've seen more tensions with the resurgent China. Those two powers have really dominated the headlines and dominated the economic implications for both Chile and New Zealand and the whole region. We've seen growing trade tensions, growing technology tensions, spilled into financial tensions and political tensions between the two powers. And of course, COVID has made everything more difficult and more acute in all of this. We now have health tensions between the two. We're shortly to expect to see some vaccine supply chain rollout, and no doubt there'll be some tensions in that also. Of course, the Americas, North America and South America, have been very hard hit by the whole COVID pandemic. And at the same time, I guess in both countries, we're becoming more and more aware with perverse climatic events about the climate change issues that we've got ahead of us. So really, there's a lot of very big challenges. China has responded to the US tensions with more growth and with new policies. And as we go through this year, we've watched the IMF forecasts, which were for almost all the countries in the region to actually contract. And yet China has surprised us by, it looks like they will have growth this year and more growth next year. And that's given them a certain standing, at least economically, around the region. They're also responding with a new policy of dual circulation, which we think means a lot more self-sufficiency, but also they clearly intend to stay open to technology and other imports where it suits them. What we're seeing in supply chains, I think, is particularly notable around the ASEAN region and actually Mexico as well, as we see some movements of investment out of China, sometimes from Chinese, sometimes from Americans, sometimes from other countries, into the ASEANs. They're revamping their supply chains. We're certainly seeing some final production leaving China and being done in the ASEANs on its way into the US, but we're also seeing Chinese supply chains changing as this goes on as well. I've been looking back actually a couple of decades ago. A famous Argentinian economist, Raul Prebisch, but of course he made his home to a large extent in Chile. He died in Santiago some years ago. Raul Prebisch was famous for having staffed the first United Nations Regional Development Agency for Latin America in Santiago in the post-war years. And he's famous for the Prebisch hypothesis, which basically says that we saw at that stage a lot of raw materials coming out of the south and going into northern industrial markets. And as those northern industrial markets continued to grow, they actually managed to get a larger share of the value add out of that whole supply chain for their own domestic northern markets for various competitive reasons. And not very much of that occurred in southern markets, Chile, New Zealand, the same. And in fact, not much value add increase in those southern markets. And in a way, and we saw terms of trade not improving a lot as a result. In a way, that's still an issue for us. The Prebisch hypothesis is still there. It applies to New Zealand just like to Chile. So New Zealand and Chile, two small, southern, rationalist, trading countries, suffering the tyranny of distance, but sometimes also taking advantage from their more isolation. Similar insights. So we saw with Chile's 2019 APEC year, many of the issues that were coming up were ones that were very important for New Zealand as well. I used to run the Treasury Department in New Zealand, and we took quite a lot of interest in what Chile was doing on fiscal policy and some of the innovative things that it had in mind there. I also was governor of the central bank for a while in New Zealand, and there Chile used to send delegations to the central bank in Wellington to look at what we were doing on monetary policy, and we took advice from you on your new note issues. So we've always been quite close. We've found quite a lot in common around policies. And of course, we all know that the CPTPP originated from the P4. Two of the key members of the P4 were New Zealand and Chile through all of this. So we're both concerned at these growing power tensions. We're both concerned at the potential for the increase in protection. We're both concerned to look at what the new incoming president of the United States, Biden, might do in terms of protectionist policy. I don't think we're expecting that to change very significantly, but we certainly hope that it won't continue to worsen. And we're both very aware of being in the throes of COVID vulnerability at the minute. The IMF forecast for Chile this year is a contraction of 6%. That's huge. For New Zealand, we're probably expecting something about half that. We're both expecting growth next year, but we will not get back to where we were before COVID started. And in fact, we've both got 2 or 3 years that we'll have to make up on as a result of all of this. In the meantime, we're both keen on trade diversification. Of course, New Zealand's history was with its very great trade dependence on the United Kingdom before they went into the EU. Big irony now, we're seeing United Kingdom in urgent trade negotiations with New Zealand and with many other countries as it tries to stitch together arrangements when it leaves, now that it's left the EU. But in our case, we're looking at much more China economy dependence, and Chile as well, of course. Some dependence on US markets in the past, now increasingly on China also. I think both of the countries are making quite slow progress in terms of trying to increase value add. And we're the originator of supply chains with both our agricultural produce and Chile's mineral production. We come in right at the beginning of supply chains. It has meant that it's harder for us to grab value add, and we've seen other countries take more advantage from doing that. I think that there's an argument, for example, that Singapore gets more value add out of New Zealand dairy product going into China than New Zealand does. So we've got some very serious issues, but they're very common issues in all of that. We're now both looking at new trade tech. So we're looking at food security possibilities through supply chain management, tracking and tracing, what that can do for both markets and originating countries, the whole range of electronic trade, and the sorts of steps forward that we've managed to do during the COVID lockdowns as well in all of this. We've both got a real interest in climate change issues, sustainable production, renewable energy, and we want to learn from where you go on green hydrogen, for example. We're both quite big on wind and solar. We're both interested in looking at how we get lower emissions in the future. We're both interested, I think, in looking at how wood fiber sophisticated developments might start to supplant some of the polymer uses, for example. We're both very interested in ocean issues and fishing and so on. Next week, New Zealand takes over from Malaysia to host APEC, and you'll see a whole range of policy proposals that are there for the New Zealand year, where we're looking for Chilean support, and many of them use the broad theme of how we all recover from COVID as a way of changing and moving our focus for the vision for APEC moving forward. Thanks very much, Jorge. I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Alan. Before going to the Vice Minister of Trade from Chile, I would mention that participants can ask by our Q&A function if you have comments or questions for the panelists. Vice Minister, there is Rodrigo Yáñez. You have mentioned the importance of diversification from Chile, thinking of the future. How do you see the challenges and the opportunities for our trade policy in this new landscape and the policy responses associated with that?
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for inviting me here to this panel. I wish to also greet Dr. Bollard. It's a pleasure to see you again, even if it's virtually, and the rest of the panelists, of course. In this sense, I think the pandemic has taught us also a lesson in terms of how important is, on one hand, that like-minded countries align and act coordinated together, that how important is, in fact, that multilateral organizations actually work and deliver. There is this saying that I always use, which is when two elephants collide, it's the grass that suffers. And in this case, countries like New Zealand and Chile suffer the most out of these situations. And we also resemble in terms of having among our top trading partners countries such as China and the US. So I think the first lesson is that we need to speed up the process. And the first of that is that when thinking in trade diversification, we need to go digital as well. And we need to think on trade 3.0. And, you know, it's not just about interconnected single windows. It must go beyond that. It must go on the, you know, the Internet of Rules and other aspects of trade 3.0 that like they call it, and in that playing field, I think we need to think seriously about the rules of digital trade or trade in the context of a digital economy. And that is not just restricted to trade of goods through virtual or electronic platforms, but it needs to address also trade of digital goods itself. And in that sense, I think one of the first steps that we have made is with signing the DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement with New Zealand and Singapore last June, which will enter into force next January. And also on other trade fronts, such as the Pacific Alliance, where we will be launching a digital regional market on December, but also in other modernization processes that we're having right now, such as the South Korea FTA and also the EU. So the first is to think on the rules that we need for that to flourish. And what I'm saying is that diversification will have to go hand in hand with digital economy, with trade in the digital economy era and services. And our economies also are, you know, natural resources dependent, or commodities like us in Chile. But we need to think on how it has also been an incredible source of talent, of services, of very advanced human capital which we need to translate into exports. And for that, we need to address this discussion that I mentioned on rules and at the different levels. I mentioned some at the plurilateral or bilateral sphere, but also at the WTO. And in this sense, also New Zealand and Canada have been acting jointly. We both belong to the Ottawa Group, where we also a few months ago have stressed in the political statements that we made the language around digital economy and on how we need e-commerce negotiations to advance at the WTO. And on diversification, I think there's also a way to think on value chains, global value chains, the way that they are reshaping, and how services are also very an important component of value chains, and how we need to, again, touching again back on the topic of rules, how we need to pave the way so that our exporters have a level playing field. But we need to also increase our participation in global value chains, also when considering services and the way that they increasingly are becoming part of our exports. Of course, there is a component when it comes to geographical diversification, which is something that we're also covering. We want to increase our presence in Southeast Asia. We look with great attention the recent RCEP signature, but we also have other avenues that we are exploring, such as the ANZSTA agreement or that the ASEAN +2 agreement, where also New Zealand happens to be a strategic partner with the Pacific Alliance, associated members, where we hope that we can advance more than we have in the past few years. But also on other fronts, such as India, such as Eurasia, the North of Africa, the Gulf countries, all of Africa, which are unexplored or uncharted waters for Chilean exporters. So I think the call after this pandemic is also for them to get out of their comfort zone and also join us in this effort of investing in expanding our presence to these other geographical areas where we either are not present or are way below our full potential given their imports. But we have, as you probably well know, a very strong FTA network. We have a good coverage of that, but we need to do more in that unexplored part of the world. 95% of our exports go to a country with whom we have an FTA, and all of this part of the world either doesn't have an FTA or we have agreements which are very, partial. So I think when thinking in diversification, we are thinking very seriously in expanding the digital aspect of it, its rules, its infrastructure. And here I want to also mention the Trans-Pacific fiber optics cable that would connect us with New Zealand and Australia, and from there with the rest of Asia, and also with the recent 5G network bidding process, which will be crucial and instrumental to also give the technical and infrastructure tools that our exporters need to provide their services, to sell their products worldwide. And in this endeavor, I think countries like New Zealand and Chile should keep acting, and increasingly even more in the international and multilateral sphere. But also in terms of diversification, what we're doing geographically speaking in other parts of the world. And we're eager to re-identify opportunities with trading partners after this recomposition of global value chains that we have seen, not just because of the pandemic, but also starting from this decoupling from between the US and China and the trade tensions. We are extremely exposed to international markets. 57% of our GDP is explained because of trade, but also it's interesting to mention that from the export side, it's been also incredibly resilient to this pandemic. And I would say, and also when we think on the social crisis in Chile in October last year, also resilient to that. From on a year-to-year basis, if you look at the 10 first months of this year compared to the last year, exports have decreased only by 1.7%. So I think compared to other economic sectors and the drop in our GDP, this is a sector that is driving definitely the economic recovery, and we need to reinforce it, make it more resilient, and certainly more inclusive. We're also, I am extremely happy and proud to be a partner with New Zealand and countries like Canada on issues like the ETAG, which is linked to originally with the signature of the CPTPP, but that we have made into something else with an agenda that has already delivered, for instance, the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement, which is also a first of its kind, and the way to think seriously, and not just because of being a nice slogan, the incorporation of SMEs, of women, of our original indigenous people to trade, and that I think will be paramount to keep trade sustainable, legitimate among our citizenship, and that needs to drive also the agenda of the future of trade. We cannot have one without the other. I think they are very interconnected. This pandemic has shown a lot of weaknesses that we all have in inclusion, in gaps that we have. And certainly one huge gap that arises from this pandemic is the digital one. And that is connected with SMEs, with women-owned SMEs, with indigenous peoples, etc. So I think on diversification, we need to think at the same time, like I said, in digital trade, in this geographical also diversification, but at the same time with a very strong sense, an urgent sense of inclusion when it comes to trade, because we can no longer afford and let our citizens to not be fully aware of how connected their lives are with trade on a daily basis, that their jobs depend on it, that their consumption depend on it, that our competitiveness also depend on it, and that's it's a task that we must all also endeavor as a nation. So I think in that New Zealand is an extremely important partner, and I'm pretty sure that we will keep working very hard during the next year, during the post-pandemic recovery phase. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Claire, I'd like to discuss the New Zealand perspective. You also are an export-based economy, meat, dairy products like copper in our case. How can you think about the future of trade in New Zealand, given that you are an exports-based economy, and also the work you have made in the past, the Trade for All work, in terms of, in order to put more legitimacy to the trade policy and the benefits of that?
Thank you, Jorge. Good morning to our New Zealand audience, and muy buenas tardes a todos y todas in Chile. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think Dr. Bollard and Vice Minister Yanez have described the circumstances in which we all find ourselves, but particularly small export-focused nations at present. So in response to your question, Jorge, I'm going to focus on diversification of risk in trade policy. And the risks that we're thinking about in this regard are three, really, that we're facing as a small trading nation. The new one, of course, being the pandemic, the virus and the impact that it is having on our economy and the global economy in which we operate. Another risk that predated the virus, but is certainly exacerbated by it, is the deterioration of the multilateral trade architecture, which has been such a which has been the support network within which New Zealand has operated as a trading nation for the last 30 years. And the realization that that deterioration is due in part to the perception that, as Vice Minister Yanez mentioned, that rules for trade are outdated and that they're no longer fit for purpose and need to be reformed and modernized for the way trade functions today. Another risk that we're very conscious of, which also the previous two speakers have mentioned, is that loss of social license around the idea of an ambitious trade policy, which arises from a number of things, but we see it in New Zealand arising from public concern about globalization and a sense that whole segments of our population have missed out on the benefits of trade. And that has been translated in various countries, as we've seen, into a rise in unilateralism and protectionism, including amongst some countries which have traditionally been the leaders of an ambitious trade project. In New Zealand's policy response to this situation has got a number of strands, but I'm going to focus on one in particular, which is we call concerted open plurilateralism, which is the idea of, in a situation of turbulence and change, that we look for new and creative ways to take forward our trade policy and trade negotiation agenda with like-minded countries who are often smaller economies, and that we look to break impasses and develop and drive new rules and new coalitions of interest through those smaller groups. And Chile, of course, is a very natural partner for New Zealand in this endeavour. The best example, which I think Dr. Bullard mentioned, was the P4, which from a modest start has resulted in the CPTPP, which is which we all know of in terms of a piece of very critical trade architecture. Two particularly interesting examples which have been mentioned in passing are the DEPA and the ITAG, and I'm just going to spend a little more time on those two processes. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, as Vice Minister Yanez mentioned, is a plurilateral agreement with Chile, Singapore and New Zealand, and it's quite groundbreaking in its way, covering a range of issues from trade facilitation to digital inclusion and emerging areas such as artificial intelligence. And it has really been an example of three small like-minded countries coming together to co-create new norms on this critically important area of digital trade. It's been designed to be open, to grow in membership and scope over time. So we see it as being, having the potential to be quite influential in digital trade in a number of ways, as a pathfinder that has innovative provisions for adoptions in other contexts, through direct accession by interested WTO members, and transformation over time into a wider agreement as P4 transformed to CPTPP. Vice Minister Yanez mentioned that the DEPA will enter into force in January of next year. In the meantime, there is a SME dialogue underway, and a great deal of ongoing cooperation between our agencies. The DEPA, the ITAG, moving on to the ITAG, the Inclusive Trade Action Agenda, that is another means through concerted open plurilateralism to address issues around a loss of social license for trade policy and concern about the narrow spread of benefits arising from the work that we do in the trade negotiation space. You referred in your introduction to New Zealand's Trade for All agenda. This has been a trade policy direction that we have taken to review all our trade policy settings and ensure that they deliver for the widest possible spread of New Zealanders, and that all New Zealanders can see the benefits for themselves, for their families, for their businesses, for the economy at large in New Zealand's trade policies and our connection to the rest of the world. It's been a large piece of work which involves a number of different New Zealand economic agencies, and we've really seen a lot of benefits from it. The Inclusive Trade Action Group is our work to bring that perspective into the plurilateral realm, if you like. And again, Chile has been a very natural partner for New Zealand in taking that process forward. Vice Minister Yanez talked about the global trade and gender arrangement. This is a non-binding arrangement rather than a binding agreement at this point, but it is a first in that it is really looking to focus the economic empowerment of women at the centre of the arrangement, and to create that imperative for domestic policy settings that permit women to and women-led businesses to be able to integrate themselves very into the heart of our exporting sector, which currently in New Zealand anyway continues to be more male dominated. We're at a very exciting stage in the evolution of the gender arrangement, in that the three partners, Chile, Canada and New Zealand, have identified a range of other countries we want to take this idea to and begin discussions with. So that process is getting underway at the moment. And looking ahead, the ITAG is looking to explore Indigenous trade as a next issue of focus, where all the three countries all have strong Indigenous economies. In New Zealand, the Māori economy has a very substantial asset base in primary production, and there is a very strong and well-formed Māori economy which looks to the world. We want to explore ways through the ITAG of advancing that, of supporting and facilitating our Indigenous communities to work between themselves and to drive their economies for the betterment of their communities. So from the diversification perspective, we're looking at concerted open plurilateralism as another way of driving diversification of risk, diversification of partnership, and having through that connection with our like-minded countries such as Chile, coming up with some of the answers and the solutions to these problems that are besetting our global trade environment. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you, Claire, for your insights. Herman, you have conducted a research on export diversification comparing Chile with Australia and New Zealand. And you highlighted two ways. One was in general terms, one was promoting diversification within the natural resources, and the other one promoting services exports. Can you deepen on your study, and how do you see the Chilean and New Zealand projection on diversification?
Of course, Jorge, thank you very much. for the invitation to share our view about this topic related to Chilean export. Well, I would like to start saying that some economists and risk rating agencies usually highlight that our economy is not diversified enough. And of course, it's true because the Chilean external sector is very dependent on copper exports. About 50% of our export are copper or mining products. But they generally go on and to say that the lack of diversification is likely to be a restriction for the development of the economy. The second step is first, lack of diversification. Second step is a restriction for the development of the economy. This topic is particularly relevant right now in Chile because, as maybe you know, some weeks ago, the people in Chile voted in favor of writing a new constitution. In this context, some people believe that it is an opportunity for change on several fronts, including changes to our economic model, in which the openness to the international trade and the export of natural resources are very relevant, are important points of our strategy of development. Well, as you say, Jorge, in a recent working paper we wrote with Felipe Larraín, former Chilean Minister of Finance, and Oscar Perelló, a PhD student in London, we tried to give an answer to the question of the lack of diversification of our economy and the potential effect of that on the development of the country. And we do that making a comparison with Australia and New Zealand. I would like to say that we review the diversification in terms of product, okay? Not in terms of market, for example, or risk, as the previous panelists talk. I think there is different dimension of that topic. We review the topic of the products. Well, first in our study, we first ask why we should compare with the Chilean economy with Australia and New Zealand instead of other developed countries like Singapore or South Korea, for example. The first part of our study talk about this topic. Well, in our opinion, the comparison between Chile, Australia, and New Zealand is appropriate across at least 4 dimensions. First, because the 3 countries are small open economies, okay? Second, because Australia and New Zealand became developed over a more recent period of time compared with other countries. In third place, because Australia and New Zealand have structural similarities with Chile, like the macroeconomic policy framework. Maybe as you know, the 3 countries have inflation targeting, exchange rate, floating exchange rate, fiscal rule. Also because their commercial and financial openness, the wealth of natural resources, of course, and their geographical distance from the rest of the world are common characteristics between these 3 countries. And fourth, when Australia and New Zealand had an income equivalent to what Chile has today, they were more similar to us than other developed countries. Well, so in the first part of our study, we answered this question. We put a lot of information and evidence on that question. And the second part of the study, we make the following. We use very disaggregated export data to have from 1,000 to 5,000 lines of export of products. And we constructed different concentration measures of export. We construct the tail index, the Gini index, and the Herfindahl index. Maybe you know that's index because they usually are used as measures of income distribution, the Gini index, or market concentration, like the Herfindahl index. But we use that indicator for export, for products that we in Chile and Australia and New Zealand export. I would like to briefly told you about our results. First, our first result is the following. Chile has a level of export concentration equivalent to or lower than Australia, okay, using the three indicators that I mentioned. But our concentration is higher than that of New Zealand, okay? Second conclusion is the following. The current level of concentration of our products in Chile remains similar to that of 1990, okay? The change has very, very low. And the third conclusion is Australia and New Zealand have grown their export concentration over time, have grown their export concentration. And this is related especially to the traditional sector, okay? So we observe that the concentration of export in Australia and also in New Zealand have increased over time, and especially in traditional export. Let me take a couple of more minutes to talk more specifically about Chile and New Zealand and our conclusions. Well, New Zealand is usually used as a development reference for Chile, in part, in our opinion, because in 1994, it exceeded the per capita GDP of our country. So it's an even closer experience than Australia, because Australia exceeded our per capita GDP in 1981. So this is one of the main points. The second point is that New Zealand is also a smaller economy than Australia. New Zealand, similar than Chile, we represent around 0.3% of world GDP. We are a very small economy. Now, when we analyzing New Zealand export from when it had an income level equivalent to that of Chile, we can see New Zealand traditional export grew from 27% to 34% of total export, while its manufactured export decreased from 25% to 16% of total export. Well, for us, this is a relevant topic because in the internal discussion, political and economic discussion, a lot of people say that Chile should increase their production and export of manufacturing export. But the experience of New Zealand is not in that direction. Our analysis reaffirms that New Zealand economic development did not occur, and maybe our panelists can confirm or not our conclusion, but our analysis shows that the New Zealand economic development did not occur as traditional export were displaced by more sophisticated products, but instead its economic advance was in parallel with a specialization process in its traditional dairy and meat products, the export where it had comparative advantage. So we come back to the beginning of the economy. So the countries have to export products where they have comparative advantage. In the case of Australia and New Zealand, dairy and in the case of New Zealand, dairy and meat products. In the case of Australia or Chile, mining products especially. And to wrap up then, the cases of Australia and New Zealand suggest that diversification, of course, in terms of products, I'm talking about products, diversification into value-added or manufactured product is not a necessary condition for economic development. It's not a necessary condition. And this is in line with the economic evidence that finds that export diversification does not have a causal effect on the income level of a country. Instead, the evidence suggests that trade policy should primarily focus on export promotion and not on diversification itself. Thus, as a possible development strategy for Chile in our proposal, an option is to strengthen export development without bias, even if this leads to a greater share of traditional export. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Maybe in the next intervention, I could talk more about our study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herman. The study is available at the Center for Public Studies in Chile. You can access by internet because some participants have asked about the report, the working paper. Dr. Bollard, Claire mentioned the concept of diversification of risks. You have worked for a long time for APEC, and I would ask you, for countries like New Zealand and Chile, with at least high reliance on China or growing reliance on China, what are the strategies or alternatives you see to diversify the risk, given the fact that the strategic confrontation between United States and China actually affects New Zealand and Chile? How do you see the way to diversify the risk?
Well, thank you, Jorge and Herman. Very interesting study, very interesting conclusions. New Zealand's choice to move out of manufacturing was particularly because of the fact that we had some extremely inefficient import protection for a very small market and very high unit costs. So yes, in the 1980s, we reduced our manufacturing sector by about 1/3. And what has happened is we've continued to grow traditional exports. That wasn't particularly a policy choice. That's pretty much been comparative advantage showing through and leading to more development, as Herman said, in dairy, in meat production, and in some other agricultural, horticultural, and particularly forest production as well. And that growth has been driven out of Chinese demand and other East Asian demand particularly. For us in this part of the world, we've seen the growth of quite sophisticated regional and local supply chains around Southeast Asia. But the main part of what New Zealand's doing is still shipping large tons of product offshore. And we I think, don't have so much a problem about product diversification, but we do have a question about product intensification, where we're not getting a lot of value, and in some cases it's clearly gone backwards. In the area of forestry, which is again is a sector with Pinus radiata that we share with Chile, we are finding a lot less domestic value add. By far our biggest exports now is simply chopping down trees and shipping out logs. They're going to China, where the huge volume that they're managed to aggregate means that they've got very sophisticated production, and they're using sawmilling arrangements that get a much higher return out of the wood of the tree than we've been able to do. And we've got to really work out how much we can improve our domestic value added. We are growing dependence on China. Actually, we look to Australia there because Australia is very dependent on the Chinese market, and of course has suffered quite a lot from tension with regard to China and from pressure back from China on Australia, limiting some of their quite key exports. And that is making us just think about market diversification as well as product diversification. But ultimately, a lot of what we export will have some Chinese content, even if it's not final Chinese market. Much of our product, for example, dairying, may start off as milk powder in New Zealand, but can end up as quite complex and sophisticated pharmaceuticals in various markets in East Asia or North America for that matter as well.
Thank you, Alan. Vice Minister Yanez, we know that unfortunately the TPP is still pending the Congress approval, and this raised a question about the narrative of trade. How can you explain deeper how the work you are leading about the narrative of trade to show better or communicate better the benefits associated with the interconnected economies and the trade from Chile?
Well, I think that there's an important communicational effort in doing some stakeholder management and take it to a new level. Like I was mentioning, 2.8 million jobs in Chile are directly or indirectly related to trade. and also the participation of SMEs in our added value exports or value-added exports. It's very important and increasing in numbers. So I think the first is to make Chileans more graphic the way they involve or are involved with trade. How thousands of SMEs rely on being suppliers of export companies, on the jobs that I was mentioning, and others. And I think in that sense also it's important this like-minded exercise on a common approach to trade. What we did with the CPTPP was precisely in the context of the ETAC to assess the impact of the agreement. And this is something that we do for the first time in an FTA from different perspectives, mainly related to inclusion and social and regional economic development, environmental issues. And we need to be more accountable in terms of the performance of the agreements, the impacts in issues that are not specifically, to trade in goods related. And I think that trade is, well, it's not the final goal, it's a tool. But I think a very important tool to be successful in this new dynamic that we're facing and in the new economy that we know it's right there. So I think it's a reality sort of check what happened with the CPTPP, which is not strange or unique to Chile only. Trade is something that is also at the top of mind issues in public discussions on globalization, and this deglobalization exercise on protectionism, on all of that it's over the table these days. But it's an opportunity also to drive the attention of the people around trade. And I think we're also paying a price of making it an assumption, like taking it for granted and not really explaining how important it is and it will be for our economic recovery and well-being. So that is something that we are working and that we are increasingly stressing with New Zealand and Canada in the context of ETAC. Now we are working on the launch of a trade and indigenous people also agreement, which, like Claire said, there are no binding, but nevertheless they drive a lot of virtuous movements around these issues. And this is a way that we will keep working. We made women at the center also one of the top priorities of our APEC year. We were able to agree on the La Serena roadmap, which was mentioned by the leaders in the past summit. We are launching the same in the Pacific Alliance next December. And we will keep working on SMEs, digitization of SMEs, and like I said earlier, paving the rule book that they need so that trade can be also more coming to flesh for people, and the tool also to prosper and really lower barriers. I think this revolution of trade and digitalization in this past months. Also, I think we need to turn it into an opportunity, because it's a fact that our SMEs and people, the way they get more tools to go digital, the more democratic trade involves, and they can deal with their consumers in the other part of the world, or their importers, and it makes trade more efficient, faster, and at the end of the day, it's an incredibly powerful tool to democratize also trade. And I think that's the the challenge, but the opportunity that we want to grasp from now on.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Claire, one of the purposes of this activity is to learn each other between Chile and New Zealand. And you mentioned two important topics for my perspective. The first is you can go deeper on the social license concept. And the other, what is the strategies that you are engaging stakeholders in this whole process of thinking about your trade policy and more inclusive and more open?
Thank you, Jorge. That's a good question. I'll answer the second one first, around how we've changed our engagement. New Zealand for many years had a bilateral, or we had a trade policy that was accepted by all our political parties, and that was very severely tested during the negotiation of the TPP. And we saw for the first time an end to, or a severe fracture in a bipartisan approach to our trade policy. And that for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade was a really strong indication that there was more that we needed to do in terms of telling the story, just as Rodrigo has outlined, and making it more obvious to people, to New Zealanders, what stake they had in our trade policy and the outcome of our trade negotiations. So really, we intensified what we did. We've created a specific standalone unit as part of our trade and economic group, and we're extremely active in our consultation practice. We listen a lot more than we used to what SMEs, exporters, importers, what people want to tell us about what they want to see in New Zealand's trade policy. And of course, the government's Trade for All agenda has really driven us in that and set this very high benchmark for us. At the beginning of the last government, as a new direction in trade policy, a whole process was run around the Trade for All agenda, which started with quite a big consultation process. We had an online consultation, we had traditional town hall meetings, in which we asked New Zealanders what they wanted from their trade policy and what their concerns were about it. There was then a board appointed called the Trade for All Advisory Board, which was a board that reported directly to the Minister for Trade and Export Growth, and was made of 25 representatives from all over the New Zealand economy, really representing a huge diversity of interests, and all parts of the spectrum of perspectives around trade and its value to our economy. And that board spent a year deliberating in real detail about the nuts and bolts of our trade policy and what our objectives should be for our trade connection with the world. The board delivered its report to government in November of last year, and in doing so delivered 53 recommendations for how our trade policy should evolve. And the government made its response to that report in March of this year, and basically undertook to implement all those recommendations. So we have this very detailed blueprint roadmap about what New Zealanders expect from us as officials in delivering our trade policy. And that guides us in our intensified information exchange, in talking to exporters and everybody with an interest in the trade area. And in terms of what we learn from others in that regard, Chile has been has shown real leadership, I think, particularly in respect of the Trade and Gender initiative. it has concluded several chapters in several trade negotiations. I think in the Chile agreement and in the Europe FTA on gender. So we were very keen to partner with Chile in the ITAC process because we knew we had a lot to learn from Chile in terms of taking our own work forward in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Herman, one of the conclusions of your study is that rather than reshaping the model of Chilean economy is taking advantage of the opportunities in the natural resources sector or in the services one. What are the recommendations or the policy recommendations that you can share with the audience based on your research?
Okay, thank you. Well, as you know, Jorge, we conclude in our study that product diversification is not a necessary condition for economic development, based on the experience of Australia and New Zealand. However, in our opinion, efforts should be put into deepening and enabling international trade. So we agree that we need to continue deepening our network of markets around the world. In terms of public policies, at the end of our study, we recognize that they have a role to play. And we propose, also from our experience in the Ministry of Finance, 2 additional ways to advance in Chile. One option refers to promoting export diversification within each product sector. In our opinion, this will strengthen the sector that we have comparative advantage. So in line with the conclusion of our study, we state that we can increase our diversification within for example, the agricultural or the mining sector. At the same time, this could permit us to increase the variety of export, the number of products that we export. But again, export where we have comparative advantage, no other products. There exists a working paper written by Felipe Larraín and Oscar Perelló at the beginning of this year, where they show that this type of diversification, so within a sector particular, they talk about the natural resources sector, can contribute to GDP growth. So we have some evidence in that sense. And the other option that we propose is to take advantage of Chile's institutional and economic strengths, especially compared with the rest of Latin America, and to diversify towards the export of services. We especially propose to advance in the line of increase the export of financial services. We think that Chile has a big opportunity in terms of Latin America to convert in a global or at least regional financial center. Chile have taken some steps in that direction in the past, but we still have plenty of room to grow in terms of services exports, especially financial services, I told you, Jorge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herman. We have 2 questions from the director of Cape Latin American Center. Matthew, please.
Thank you, Jorge. These questions are actually to all 4 panelists, and they're really driven by the fact that we have a lot of exporters who are participating in this event. The policymakers and the academics of both countries are aware of the need to collaborate and the advantages of collaborating. How can we raise awareness among the business communities and the exporters of both nations of the advantages of collaboration and the fact that this collaboration is continuing, this dialogue is going? And related to that, what stops more collaboration between our exporters and diversifying markets?
Thank you. Maybe in the same order, first, Dr. Bollard.
Sure. Well, interesting question, and I think this comes back to the root of the relationship between New Zealand and Chile. We're quite similar, and we like cooperating, but we also compete. And if you go back through a couple of decades with New Zealand development of Pinus radiata and kiwi fruit, for example, apples, salmon, dairying, these were all areas we competed quite intensely with Chile. And in some cases, we tried investing, in some cases did successfully invest in Chile to get common approaches. When it comes down to it, we've both got these natural resources. We're both quite distant from markets, and neither of us is a big source of domestic savings. And so consequently, we've got the same sort of factors and the same sort of challenges, good reasons for cooperation, but actually from an economic point of view, New Zealand exporters in this area don't go to Chile looking for capital markets, for example, although maybe if what Herman says happens in a decade or so, they might. But there's a strong competition going on as well as a cooperation. And I think that's always going to be in the back of the minds of a lot of business people.
Thank you. Vice Minister? Or Vice Minister is here, or maybe Claire? You can start, Claire.
Happy to, Jorge. I wonder also if there's an issue. I mean, I think what Dr. Bollard said is very pertinent. I also wonder if there's an issue of bandwidth, given that, as we've acknowledged, a lot of the exporters in both countries are small, medium exporters, and even MISMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises. There simply may not be a great deal of spare capacity within some of our exporters to think about collaboration, if by collaboration we're talking about together in third markets. I mean, I would note that in respect of New Zealand and Chile, there has been quite a degree of that collaboration, for example, between Frontera and Saprole in terms of joint initiatives, investment, and then expansion into third markets. So, I mean, I think business doesn't really need to be told much from government about the benefits of collaboration. It's very natural for our exporters to seek out partners, and where there and those opportunities have been taken in the past. I suppose what we can do in the future is look to create more platforms for connecting. For example, in the doing what we can to encourage our businesses to be able to get to know each other. For example, as part of New Zealand's trade recovery strategy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is intensifying its efforts to act on behalf of exporters in their markets and amplify their voice in key markets. And New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, our economic development and trade promotion agency, is doubling its offer to New Zealand companies to give them that ability to connect with counterparts in other markets. So I think we'll see a lot of development in this area in the next few years.
Sorry, thank you, Claire. Vice Minister.
We're good, thank you, Jorge. No, I think, well, it's true what Dr. Bollard says in terms of how we compete, but that makes us also to face the same challenges. So it's extremely important that we have this fine tuning from the trade perspective with New Zealand and how we face, and this is something that we do with trade in New Zealand on facing common challenges in other markets. We learn from their experience. Other occasions, New Zealand learn from ours. And when we talk about inclusive trade, we have an agenda that I think benefits us all from that perspective as well. Now, when thinking in how we could further interconnect our economies, well, I think some barriers relate, for instance, on the trade perspective. I think from on the infrastructure side, I think the cable will be a game changer, the fiber optics cable, when thinking in our small and medium enterprises that provide high technology services, for instance. They need a good quality of connection. And that today does not exist when facing issues such as, you know, EOT and artificial intelligence, etc. And that's really important. But also from the logistics perspective, one issue we have is that we don't have very frequent lines, right? In our ships. Our markets are small, so our trade goes mainly through airplanes, or it uses another, shipping line that is more frequent with Asia or Southeast Asia and Oceania. And I think we need to do an exercise where we can think together or jointly, like we do with other countries in the region, in global or regional value chains, and see how we could, improve and reinforce that collaboration between us. And that is about connecting our business communities, our trade promotion agencies. Also, we need to, do an exercise with numbers, with data. And in fact, we sent someone from our research team to the ministry in New Zealand to learn more about the way New Zealand approaches from a quantitative perspective, in thinking in how they model agreements. And I think we should expand that precisely to also adapt to these new challenges that we see after this pandemic. But I think regardless of not being at first hand very natural for someone that is not closely related with trade issues between Chile and New Zealand, it's one of the most beneficial relations that we have from the trade perspective, regardless of not having actual, much trade between our countries. But actually, it's incredibly important how we provide feedback, and we benefit from that when facing challenges that, because of resembling each other, we also face on the challenges side.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Herman, would you like to add something to these two questions?
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, I was thinking in the answer, but really, New Zealand is a country that we admire in Chile. We look New Zealand as an example to follow. I think we have to observe a lot of things from New Zealand, from the experience of New Zealand. I write three ideas. First, in terms of knowledge and education. I think we have a gap in quality of education in different sectors, in engineering, technical education, that we can absorb a lot from the experience of New Zealand. The second one is I think it's necessary for exportation, is modernization of the state. We have a problem with our state because it's very low, it's very old, and the pandemic showed that we don't have a modern state that we need for give the help to the people or to our development. We need a modernization of the state. I think New Zealand is a very well example of that. and of course, we usually are looking at New Zealand because the quality of their public policies. And I think since the last year, we are with some problems in social terms, with a lot of social unrest and mobilizations. So we are reviewing our constitution, our way to make public policies, and I think that we need to recover our social stability to advance to the process of development. And I think we can learn a lot of the experience of New Zealand, and we need the experience and the collaboration in that topics. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. The Vice Minister has to leave because he has a meeting with the President. Maybe, Rodrigo, if you want to say bye-bye or just a 1-minute message.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you for the invitation. I think these opportunities give us the chance to think on the future. I think the work that was also explained by Herman and the CLAPES UC University, it's extremely important and insightful when double clicking on what we need to do to further expand opportunities, because it's more, it's a bit more tricky maybe than with other trading partners. But I think we must think, and not just on our respective markets, which are pretty small, but on how to go to third, markets. I think that is something that we should increasingly do. There is an important also experience, I think, in New Zealand investment in that sense here. But I think, especially when we think on these other services side, I think we could really empower each other as we have similar industries, we have a similar export offer, and I think in this new front of trade in the digital era, I think we must crack the puzzle in terms of expanding our trade, as I'm pretty sure that there are opportunities there to be taken. So thank you, everyone, and it's a pleasure to participate here. Thank you, Claire, and this cheers to Vangelis and Dr. Bollard and Matthew and Herman. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vice Minister. We are almost on time, but we have 1 minute, one last minute per panelist, Dr. Bollard, Claire, and Herman. Dr. Bollard.
Sure. Well, I think this has been really interesting. But I think, as Claire was saying, from New Zealand's point of view, there's a bit of a tendency to look north, not look east, if you're an exporter. And that's because that's where the markets are. And Matthew knows that very well because he's running the Latin American Centre for Asia Pacific Excellence. We have a North Asia one and a Southeast Asia one, and they find it a little bit easier to get the attention of New Zealand exporters. But that's something we're all working on, and I think we've learned from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bollard. Claire?
Just really to echo the same thought. I think the government has encouraged New Zealand exporters to focus on the Asia part of the Asia Pacific market for the last 30 years. And that's been a very successful endeavour. And our connections, our linkages, our trade with Asia has really developed as a result. There are opportunities, so many opportunities with Latin American partners, with Chile, with Mexico, and every country in between. And I think we're in a good space through the CPTPP, through our process of becoming an associate state for the Pacific Alliance, through our very close collaboration with Chile and other partners in the World Trade Organization, and through our APEC year, our host year of APEC next year, to really highlight the opportunities that our exporters on each side of the Pacific have in each other's markets and in third markets.
Thank you, Claire. Herman.
Well, I would like to say that our study shows that the best option is, for Chile at least, is continue doing what we know how to do. That is what we have a comparative advantage. It includes, of course, not only mining or agriculture, but also services, especially in a Latin American perspective. I think that Chile has a huge opportunity to develop more export services, especially thinking in Latin American markets. But Chile and also New Zealand needs the rest of the world for growth and development. So in our opinion, in my opinion specifically, Chile should continue to advance in the process of trade opening, deepening existing trade and free trade agreements, and achieving new trade agreements where countries like India, but Asia in general, seems to be a fundamental objective. So I think we need to continue with the process that we start in the 70s and continue during the 90s, because we need the rest of the world for growing. I think we need to continue giving a step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herman. I pass the floor to Stephanie Honey. She is the Associate Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum. Stephanie?
Thank you very much. In keeping with the theme of 2020, I just had to move my cat out of the screen. I'm sorry about that. Look, just in the last few minutes, I would like to take the opportunity to bring the threads together of this wonderful seminar, and thank you so much to all of these, illustrious speakers for their great insights. I guess the perspective that I'm going to bring to drawing these threads together is one from the business community, and drawing on my roles as the Associate Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum, and the Policy Advisor to the New Zealand members of the APEC Business Advisory Council. And I think, as all of our speakers have highlighted today, we're obviously living in a fundamentally changed world, and that's something that businesses and policymakers are really having to come to terms with. I think it's clear that we should not just be thinking about business as usual, but done via Zoom. We have to have a sort of fundamental rethink, if not a reset, of some of our policy and business models to contend with this disruption. But fundamentally, we're still absolutely interconnected across the Pacific between New Zealand and Chile, but also around the world, as all of our speakers have noted. The fact is, though, that it's not countries that trade, it's people and businesses. And I think, something that's a truism, but is also true, is that businesses don't really enjoy uncertainty. And clearly COVID has turned everything on its head. And that's, one of the reasons why governments and businesses support the WTO and the global rules-based trading system. I think we've also managed a good deal of resilience, even through this disruption in New Zealand and Chile. And it's also true that with uncertainty and risk comes opportunity. But of course, in order to exploit those opportunities, we need to be sure that we face a level playing field. So from a business perspective, I think we're quite worried about the way countries are going to continue to respond to this uncertainty, to COVID. As several of the speakers have highlighted, the risk of protectionism, economic nationalism, efforts from governments to reshore production or divert supply chains. So, we need governments to be shoring up economies with stimulus programs, for example, but we don't want to see a sort of a tilting of the level playing field. We need governments to be supporting businesses and putting their business communities first, but that shouldn't come at the expense of business in other countries. And of course, a really strong theme through all of this has been the need for, durable economic growth through inclusion and sustainability. So in ABAC, for example, we're very deeply concerned with achieving inclusive and sustainable growth. And that's going to be a really big focus for ABAC next year, as New Zealand is in the chair. Women's economic empowerment and Indigenous communities, as well as small business. And we're very much looking forward to working with our excellent colleagues from Chile on that. It's not just, as our speakers have all talked about, reinforcing the social license for trade. It's because it's the right thing to do. We do need to tell the story of trade better, but we also need to have a better story to tell. And it's about creating the kind of societies that we want to live in. From a business perspective, obviously, it's also about realizing the full economic potential of our communities. And so for small businesses, for women-led businesses, that means, you know, creating the right capacity and opportunity. To put it in trade policy terms, we need kind of fair rules, the ability to take advantage of the opportunities. So without having margins eroded by non-tariff barriers, for example, or trying to find our way through a tangle of conflicting trade rules. So that the work of governments in developing those trade agreements, as all of our speakers have talked about, is absolutely key. Other initiatives like the Southern Link, creating new opportunities and profile and so on, and connectivity is really key. And hand in hand with that, as Claire and Vice Chair Yanez has talked about, initiatives at the domestic policy setting level about capacity building, networking, other ways to give a helping hand are key. Also, as many speakers have highlighted, digital transformation is absolutely fundamental to this. So it's fantastic, the kind of thought leadership that New Zealand and Chile are showing through DEPA, through the WTO e-commerce plurilateral, through APEC, absolutely key to business as well as at the economy level. So COVID has, you know, the one silver lining we might say has been it's accelerated digital transformation. And, you know, from a New Zealand business perspective, it's been wonderful to see countries really turbocharging their efforts to facilitate trade digitally, so through the use of e-certificates and so on. I think the challenge now will be to lock that in as a sort of the future default, all that, you know, digital trade facilitation, single windows, acceptance of e-signatures and digital identities, absolutely core to enabling businesses to save trade costs and make trade work, even if we face ongoing disruption through the pandemic. Services as well, obviously digital technology has a huge potential to enable services trade, which is after all the engine room of economic growth for many of us, to enable that to continue to function even when we have social distancing and disruption. Also though, the issue of the digital divide is very real. Even in a wealthy country like New Zealand, you know, we do see this paradox that a lot of our small businesses don't even have a website, let alone being able to use the sort of potential of things like digital back office services or e-commerce platforms. So we really need to focus and double down on the ability of our businesses to use that. And finally, something that hasn't been, you know, hugely a focus of this morning, but I think is absolutely critical to business around the region, is the need for climate action. This is, you know, again, it's a little bit like gender inclusion or the inclusion for Indigenous communities. It's the right thing to do, but it's also really starting to impact on business activities. So in ABAC, for example, this coming year, working on climate leadership from the business community is going to be a very key focus for us. For the New Zealand business community, it's a very strong aspiration and commitment. And I think, you know, something that's really positive about it is that business has a very key role to play here as the innovators in technology and solutions, taking action directly, you know, business leadership through ESG investing or what we do in our own businesses, but also in making it clear to governments that this really fundamentally matters to us. So we want action in things like fossil fuel subsidy elimination, climate change mitigation measures, environmental goods and services, trade liberalisation and so on. So, you know, there's a daunting agenda, but I think together we can really make a difference and create the kind of societies that we want to live in. So thanks so much to all the speakers. What a wonderful seminar this has been, touching on things that really matter to our societies and to business, and absolutely fascinating as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. And finally, Matthew, our colleague, to the closing remarks.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Stephanie, for those great remarks. You've pointed a way forward for a future agenda, for future seminars that we can talk about. I'd like to thank all the panelists for presenting today, some really terrific insights. Jorge for moderating superbly. everyone here who's participated in this event. We really hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have, and I think there's a lot of things we can talk about together. New Zealand and Chile have much we can share, many experiences. The relationship is close but partial. We need to make it broader and bring the same degree of depth to the policy relationship to other facets of our engagement as well. So this has been a start. I think it's been a wonderful start. Thank you. It's been our privilege to work with the Centre for International Studies at the Catholic University, and we look forward to our future events and we'll inform you all about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all. Have a good day or good afternoon, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Hasta la próxima. Bye-bye.